The air on the ridge was thin and carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a smell that did little to mask the stench of failure clinging to 13-year-old Elijah Caldwell. He stood on the edge of the 40 acres his family had always called the Caldwell Deadweight, his gaze fixed on the scene of their supposed refuge. The cabin's roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine. The barn leaned precariously to one side as if exhausted, and the fields were so choked with grey, flat stones they looked like a graveyard for forgotten giants. Beside him, their old donkey, Rusty, let out a weary sigh, his lame leg trembling from the journey. A small choked sob broke the silence. Elijah looked down at his 6-year-old sister, Rosie, whose face was a mess of dirt and tears. She tugged on his worn shirt sleeve, her voice a fragile whisper that the wind nearly stole away. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a terror that pierced him deeper than any hunger or cold they had endured, and asked the one question he had no answer for. "Elijah, is this where we're going to die?" This is a story about the kind of hope that can only be found when all seems lost, a testament to the quiet, unseen acts of love that echo long after a person is gone. If you believe that even in the darkest of times, a single act of courage can change everything, then this journey is for you. We would be honored if you would let us know where you are listening from in the comments below. Your presence here helps build a community of listeners who appreciate stories with deep emotional resonance. Please consider leaving a like and subscribing so you don't miss the powerful conclusion to Elijah and Rosie's struggle for survival. Their story is a reminder of a strength we all possess, and it deserves to be heard through to the very end, where the true meaning of their journey is finally revealed. But to understand why that moment of absolute desolation, standing before a derelict farm in the heart of the Arkansas Ozarks, was not an ending, but the true beginning of their salvation, we must travel back 6 days. We must return to the immediate aftermath of the great tornado of 1927, to a world shattered by loss and grief. The story does not begin with the hope of a new home, but in the suffocating silence of a temporary shelter on a cold Tuesday night, when a hushed and cruel phone call overheard in the darkness forced a young boy to make an impossible choice: to flee into the unknown, or to stand by and watch the last person he had left in the world be sold away forever. His childhood was over. His only mission now was to become his sister's sole protector. The 2 weeks following the tornado were a colorless blur, a silent film of grief played on a loop inside Elijah Caldwell's 13-year-old mind. He and Rosie existed in a makeshift shelter on the edge of what used to be their town, a large canvas tent that smelled perpetually of damp earth and disinfectant. The world outside was a symphony of hammering and sawing as men rebuilt, but inside their temporary pocket of existence there was only a thick, suffocating quiet. Elijah moved through those days like a ghost, his body performing the necessary functions of survival, eating the bland stew offered by church volunteers, finding clean water, ensuring Rosie had the thickest blanket, while his spirit remained trapped in the roaring darkness of the storm. He felt a profound numbness, a protective layer of ice that had formed over his heart the moment he'd climbed from the well to find nothing left of his world but splintered wood and an unnerving empty sky. Rosie, at 6, had retreated into a world of her own. She rarely spoke, her vibrant, chattering energy extinguished by the trauma. Instead, she communicated through touch, her small hand a constant presence in Elijah's, her head often resting against his arm as if to confirm he was still there. Her silence was a heavy burden, a constant, quiet scream that echoed in the space their parents used to fill. Elijah understood. Words were useless against a force that could swallow a house whole, that could erase a mother's smile and a father's laugh from the world in a single violent breath. His primary function, the only purpose that pierced through his own fog of loss, was to be an anchor for his little sister. He was her living proof that she had not been left completely alone, a solid, breathing wall against the terrifying emptiness that now surrounded them. Their only living relative, Uncle Vernon Caldwell, arrived 3 days after the storm, his polished city shoes looking absurdly out of place against the mud-caked ground. He was their father's younger brother, a man they had met only a handful of times at holidays, and he carried with him the scent of stale cigar smoke and an air of detached efficiency. He offered them clipped, perfunctory condolences, his eyes scanning the wreckage with a look that Elijah couldn't quite decipher, a look that seemed less like sorrow and more like assessment. Vernon secured their spot in the shelter and arranged for their meals, performing the duties of a guardian with a cold precision that offered no comfort. He never hugged them, never shared a memory of their father, never asked them about the terror they had endured. His presence was a constant, unnerving weight, a sterile and unwelcome replacement for the warmth they had lost forever. While other families huddled together, sharing stories and tears, Uncle Vernon spent his days at a small Ricomaniac table, meticulously sorting through documents he had salvaged or acquired. The crisp rustle of insurance papers became the new soundtrack to Elijah's life, a dry, methodical sound that was the very opposite of the life they once lived. Vernon would spend hours with a fountain pen, his brow furrowed in concentration, making lists and calculations that had nothing to do with the two grieving children sitting just a few feet away. He spoke to them only when necessary, asking brief questions about what they remembered of the property, his inquiries always circling back to assets and ownership, never to memories or feelings. To Elijah, his uncle was not a rescuer. He was an administrator of their tragedy, a man who saw their family's end not as a wound to be healed but as an estate to be settled. The initial shock that had shielded Elijah began to recede, replaced by a sharp, cold awareness. He started watching his uncle with an intensity that went beyond a child's simple observation. He noticed how Vernon's smile was a brief, thin line that never reached his eyes, how he spoke about their parents in the past tense, with an unnerving ease as if they were distant historical figures, rather than a brother and sister-in-law he had lost just days ago. Elijah saw the way other survivors looked at Vernon with a kind of grudging respect, mistaking his emotional detachment for strength. But Elijah knew better. He had seen his father's strength in the calloused hands that could fix any machine, and his mother's strength in the gentle patience she showed a struggling seedling. Vernon's coldness was not strength. It was a void, an absence of the very thing they needed most. He found himself clinging to memories with a desperate ferocity. He would close his eyes and try to conjure the exact sound of his father's booming laugh as he told a bad joke, or the feeling of his mother's hand on his forehead when he had a fever. He remembered summer evenings on their porch, the air thick with the scent of honeysuckle, listening to his father talk about the land, even the 40 acres of useless rock in the Ozarks he called the Caldwell Deadweight. His father had spoken of it not with disdain, but with a kind of philosophical acceptance, a lesson about how some things in life simply were what they were. Those memories were agonizing, beautiful fragments of a life that now felt like a dream, and they fueled a growing, protective instinct within him that was hardening into something fierce and unyielding. In the vacuum of parental care, Elijah stepped fully into the role of Rosie's keeper. He became the architect of their small, shared world within the tent. At night, when the sounds of coughing and quiet sobbing filled the cavernous space, he would whisper stories into her ear, simple tales about talking squirrels and brave little birds who learned to fly in a storm. These were not stories their mother would have told. They were his own, forged in the immediate need to create a sliver of normalcy, a tiny shield of imagination against the harshness of their reality. He made sure she ate first, took the smaller portion for himself, and used his own body as a barrier against the cold drafts that snaked along the floor. He was no longer just a brother. He was a guardian, a storyteller, a shield, the sole curator of his sister's fragile childhood. Their old donkey, Rusty, had survived the storm, found wandering days near the riverbed with a fresh gash on his flank. He was a tangible link to their past, a creature as broken and displaced as they were. His permanent limp, the result of a poorly healed injury from years before, seemed more pronounced now. Vernon viewed the animal with open disdain, referring to him as that useless beast, and making it clear he intended to sell him for whatever little he could fetch. But for Elijah and Rosie, Rusty was family. Elijah would sneak him scraps of bread and apples, and Rosie would spend hours just stroking his coarse grey coat, whispering secrets into his long, twitching ears. The donkey's quiet, stoic endurance was a source of unspoken comfort, a silent testament to the act of simply continuing on, one limping step at a time. As the days crawled by, the atmosphere under Vernon's care grew more stifling. A tense, unspoken countdown seemed to hang in the air. Vernon's paperwork was nearly complete, and a chilling finality began to settle around him. He started watching the children, particularly Rosie, with that same assessing gaze he had once used on the wreckage of their home. It was a look that made Elijah's skin crawl, a cold, calculating stare that seemed to be measuring her worth, not as a niece or a grieving child, but as a commodity. The temporary shelter, once a place of refuge, began to feel like a cage, and Elijah felt the walls of their precarious new life closing in, squeezing the very air from his lungs with a slow, deliberate pressure. A new fear, sharper and more immediate than his grief, began to take root in Elijah's heart. It was the terrifying, formless dread of the future, of what would happen once Vernon's administrative tasks were complete. The man had made no mention of a plan, had offered no words of reassurance about where they would go or how they would live. This deliberate ambiguity was more frightening than any declared threat. Elijah's nightmares shifted. He no longer dreamt of the tornado's roar, but of a profound and terrifying silence, the silence of being utterly alone, of reaching for Rosie's hand in the dark and finding nothing there. The fear of separation became his constant companion, a cold knot in his stomach that tightened with every rustle of his uncle's papers. Their physical world shrank to the confines of the tent and the small patch of bare earth outside. They were orphans, a status that seemed to render them invisible to the bustling world of reconstruction around them. Neighbors and friends of their parents, lost in their own struggles to rebuild, offered sympathetic glances, but little more. They were two small, quiet children in a sea of loss, easily overlooked. This isolation fed Elijah's growing sense of responsibility. There was no one else. No grandparents, no aunts, no close family friends to intervene. There was only Vernon, a man who seemed more like a stranger with each passing hour, a stranger who held their entire future in his ink-stained hands. Tucked inside his shirt, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth, was the only photograph he had managed to save. It was a sun-faded image of the four of them, taken last fall at the county fair. His father was holding Rosie on his shoulders, both of them laughing, and his mother had her arm around Elijah's waist, her smile soft and full of a light that he could physically feel when he looked at it. In the darkness of the tent, he would pull it out, the worn edges of the paper a comfort to his fingertips. He was memorizing their faces, trying to burn them into his mind so that he could never forget. The photograph was both a treasure and a torment, a perfect frozen moment of a life he was no longer a part of. It was a reminder of everything he had lost and everything he still had to protect. By the evening of the 12th day, a Tuesday, a palpable change occurred. Vernon packed his briefcase with a sense of finality. His work was done. He seemed unnervingly pleased with himself, a quiet smirk playing on his lips as he surveyed the children. To Elijah, it felt like the calm before a different kind of storm, a man-made disaster he could feel gathering on the horizon. The air grew thick with unspoken intentions, and the oppressive quiet of the shelter transformed into a taut, humming wire of dread. Elijah knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that their period of waiting in limbo was over. Whatever future their uncle had arranged for them was about to be revealed, and every instinct in his body told him it was something he would have to fight. That night, the oppressive quiet of the shelter became something sharp and predatory. Sleep offered no escape for Elijah. His mind was a battlefield of formless anxieties, replaying the look of smug finality on his uncle's face over and over. He lay on his thin cot, the scratchy wool blanket pulled up to his chin, and watched the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of Rosie's small chest beside him. She was curled into a tight ball, her thumb near her mouth, a picture of innocence in a world that had proven to be anything but. A cold draught snaked across the dirt floor, carrying the distant scent of wood smoke and rain, but the chill Elijah felt came from within. He knew, with the primal certainty of an animal sensing a predator, that the fragile peace of their waiting period was about to be shattered. He was a sentry on a wall he couldn't see, guarding against a threat he couldn't yet name. It was well past midnight when the tent flap rustled, and the silhouette of Uncle Vernon slipped back inside. He moved with a practiced quietness, assuming the children were deep in slumber, his polished shoes making almost no sound on the packed earth. Elijah's eyes were slits, his breathing measured and even, a perfect imitation of sleep. He watched his uncle move to the far corner of the large tent, where a field telephone had been installed by the Relief Committee for coordinating supplies and official business. Vernon picked up the receiver, his back to the rows of sleeping families, his body angled to muffle his voice. A faint click echoed in the vast, silent space as he connected to an operator, and Elijah's entire being focused on that one corner, every nerve ending tingling with a dreadful premonition. The air grew heavy, thick with secrets about to be spilled into the darkness. At first, Vernon's voice was a low, conspiratorial murmur, a string of disjointed words that floated through the tent like smoke. Elijah strained to listen, catching phrases that seemed innocuous enough on their own. The arrangement, a good home, finalizing the details. For a fleeting, desperate moment, a sliver of hope pierced through Elijah's fear. Perhaps this was it. Perhaps Vernon had found a real family for them, a kind couple who would take them both in, a place where they could start to piece their lives back together. He imagined a warm kitchen, a soft bed, the possibility of a life that wasn't lived on a thin cot in a canvas tent. The hope was a painful, fragile thing, a tiny flame flickering in the immense darkness of his grief, and he clung to it with all his might. But then the tone of the conversation shifted, losing any pretense of compassion and hardening into the crisp, efficient cadence of a business transaction. Vernon's voice became clearer, more confident as he described Rosie. "She's a good, quiet girl," he said, the words slithering into Elijah's ears. "Hardly any trouble, perfect for helping in the kitchen and with the mending." The description was chillingly impersonal, like a farmer describing livestock. He wasn't talking about his niece, a 6-year-old girl who had just lost her parents. He was listing the attributes of a possession, outlining her utility to a potential buyer. The words, "perfect for helping," echoed in Elijah's mind, twisting into something ugly and monstrous. This wasn't about finding a home, it was about finding a servant. The conversation continued, and with each word, the monstrous truth took shape. Elijah heard his uncle calmly negotiating the terms of what he called a placement fee. The phrase was a thin veil for an unbearable reality. He was selling her. The word exploded in Elijah's mind, silent and devastating. Uncle Vernon was selling Rosie for cash. Every muscle in Elijah's body went rigid. He had to physically bite down on his own tongue to keep from making a sound. The sharp pain a welcome distraction from the agony blooming in his chest. He felt a wave of nausea, the bland stew he'd eaten for dinner churning in his stomach. The world tilted, the canvas walls of the tent seeming to close in, suffocating him with the weight of this grotesque betrayal. His sister, his sweet, silent Rosie, was being bartered away like a sack of grain. The timeline was the next blow, delivered with the same cold precision. "Sunday morning, then," Vernon confirmed into the receiver. "I'll have her ready for you at the crossroads by 9. Sunday. The word was no longer a day of the week, it was a deadline, an execution date for the life they knew. Today was Tuesday, that gave him 4 days. 4 days until a stranger would arrive to take Rosie away, to sever the last remaining bond he had in the world. He pictured her small hand being pulled from his, her confused, frightened eyes searching for him as she was driven away to a life of servitude in a distant county. The image was so vivid, so horrifying, that it eclipsed every other fear he had ever known, even the memory of the tornado's roar. This was worse. This was a deliberate act of cruelty, a slow, calculated destruction of what little remained of their family. And then came the final, damning piece of the puzzle, the motive that explained everything. After finalizing the details of Rosie's transfer, Vernon added almost as an afterthought, "And the insurance payout for my brother's estate is set to clear on Monday. The timing works out perfectly." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Vernon's plan was brutally simple. He would collect the cash for Rosie on Sunday, and on Monday, he would collect the insurance money meant for the children's future. He would take everything, erasing them completely. He would leave Elijah utterly alone, a 13-year-old orphan with nothing and no one. while he walked away with his pockets full. The meticulous paperwork, the feigned concern, the cold detachment, it was all a lie, a carefully constructed stage for his greed. The click of the receiver being placed back on its cradle was the loudest sound Elijah had ever heard. A profound, ringing silence followed, a silence that was now filled with the shape of his uncle's treachery. Elijah lay perfectly still, his heart a wild drum against his ribs, listening to the soft shuffle of Vernon's footsteps returning to his cot. He didn't dare breathe, didn't dare move a muscle until he heard the sigh of his uncle settling down, the rustle of his blanket, and the eventual shift into the slow, even breathing of sleep. Lying there in the darkness, just feet away from the man who had condemned them, Elijah felt a transformation take place within him. The boy who had been paralyzed by grief was gone, burned away in the fire of this new, terrible knowledge. The numbness that had encased his heart for 2 weeks shattered, replaced not by sorrow, but by a cold, protective fury. A chilling clarity settled over him. He was on his own. There were no adults to turn to, no authorities who would believe the frantic story of a traumatized boy over the calm, reasonable words of his legal guardian. The world was not a place of safety and order. It was a wilderness, and a predator was circling his sister. He was the only thing standing in the way. The immense weight of this responsibility did not crush him. It forged him into something new, something hard and unyielding. His childhood had ended the day of the tornado, but his purpose had just been born in the suffocating darkness of this tent. He risked turning his head just enough to see Rosie's sleeping form, her face peaceful and unaware of the danger that loomed over her. A vow formed in his soul, silent but absolute. He would not let this happen. He would not let Vernon win. He would not let the world take his sister. He did not know how, and he did not know where they would go, but he knew they had to run. The decision was not a choice, it was an instinct, a fundamental law of his new existence. He was Rosie's brother, her protector, her only hope, and he would sooner walk into the heart of another storm than let her be taken from him. The fear was still there, a cold stone in his gut, but now it was fuel for a fire that would guide his way out of the darkness. For the remainder of that Tuesday night, Elijah lay perfectly still, a statue carved from ice and fury. He listened to the sound of his uncle's soft, rhythmic snores, a sound of grotesque peace that stood in stark contrast to the war that had just been declared in Elijah's soul. The grief that had numbed him for 2 weeks was gone, burned away by the white-hot certainty of his uncle's betrayal. There was no room for sorrow, no time for tears. The world had presented him with a clear and monstrous enemy, and in doing so, it had given him something he hadn't had since the storm, a purpose. The decision to run was not a choice he made, it was a fact that settled over him, as undeniable and absolute as the ground beneath his cot. He was no longer a grieving son, he was a protector, and his entire world had shrunk to the small sleeping form of his sister beside him. The plan began to form in the darkness, a desperate and fragile thing woven from a single, half-forgotten memory. Where could they go? The world was a vast and terrifying place for 2 children with nothing, and then a flicker of his father's voice echoed in his mind. Speaking of the 40 acres of useless land deep in the Ozarks, a patch of rocky ground so undesirable it had been nicknamed the Caldwell Deadweight. His father had spoken of it with a weary laugh, a family inheritance that was more of a burden than a blessing. But to Elijah in that moment, the name sounded like a promise. It was a place Vernon would never think to look, a destination so remote and worthless it was beneath his uncle's greedy consideration. It wasn't a plan for survival. It was simply a direction, a pinprick of light in an overwhelming darkness, and he aimed for it with the entirety of his being. The next 2 days, Wednesday and Thursday, were a masterclass in silent observation. Elijah became a ghost, his movements quiet and deliberate, his eyes missing nothing. He studied his uncle's routine with a cold, analytical focus. He learned that Vernon was a creature of lazy habit, rising late and spending most of the day in town, haggling with insurance adjusters and officials. He learned that his uncle took a long, heavy nap every afternoon after his midday meal, and that he often drank from a small flask of whiskey in the evenings, a habit that plunged him into a deep, nearly comatose sleep until morning. Each observed detail was a piece of the puzzle, a weakness in the enemy's defenses. The mental clock was ticking relentlessly, Sunday, 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 and with each passing hour, Elijah's plan grew sharper, harder, and more real. He began to gather their meager resources with the stealth of a thief. The preparations had to be invisible, hidden in plain sight. He managed to secure 2 extra loaves of day-old bread from the church volunteers, wrapping them in a spare piece of canvas and hiding them at the bottom of a sack filled with his worn-out clothes. He filled a small glass jar with water from the communal pump, concealing it in the same sack. Each action was fraught with peril. Once, while he was carefully tucking the oilcloth-wrapped photograph of his parents into an inner pocket of his coat, Vernon stirred on his cot, letting out a low groan. Elijah froze, his heart hammering against his ribs, every muscle tense to run. But his uncle merely rolled over, his breathing sinking back into a heavy snore. The moment passed, but it left Elijah trembling, the cold sweat on his brow a stark reminder of how thin the line was between escape and disaster. Preparing Rosie was the most delicate and painful part of his mission. He couldn't tell her the monstrous truth. The knowledge would shatter her fragile peace. Instead, he began to weave a new story for her, a fiction to shield her from the reality of their flight. He started whispering to her at night, not of talking squirrels but of a grand adventure, a secret journey just for the 2 of them. He told her they were going to find a magic place, a castle hidden in the mountains, where they could be safe forever. Her eyes, which had been so clouded with sadness, began to show a flicker of their old light. She bought into his fantasy completely, her innocence a sharp, painful blade in Elijah's heart. He was saving her by lying to her, and the weight of that deception settled upon him, another layer of the premature adulthood he was forced to wear. On Thursday evening, as the sun set and the camp filled with the smells of cook fires and the low murmur of exhausted voices, Elijah performed a silent farewell. He looked around the sprawling tent, at the faces of the other broken families, people who, despite their own losses, had shown them small kindnesses. He looked out at the skeletal remains of his town, a landscape of ghosts and memories. This was not just an escape from Vernon, it was a final, severing departure from everything he had ever known. There was no turning back. He was stepping off the edge of the map, taking his sister by the hand and walking into the unknown. A profound loneliness washed over him, but it was quickly followed by a steely resolve. He was their last living memory, the sole keeper of the Caldwell name, and he would not fail. The fear, a constant cold companion, threatened to overwhelm him in those final hours. As he lay on his cot, waiting for the dead of night, the doubts swirled like vultures. He was just a boy. How could he possibly navigate the wilderness? How could he protect Rosie from hunger, from the cold, from the 1,000 dangers that lay in wait? What if he was leading her to a death far worse than the fate Vernon had planned? His hand instinctively went to the photograph in his pocket, the worn edges a familiar comfort. He pictured his father's hands, calloused and strong, capable of fixing any broken thing. He remembered his father's steady voice after Elijah had made a mistake on the farm. "It's not the falling down that matters, son. It's the getting up." This was his getting up. The memory was a shield, pushing the fear back into the shadows. He had decided that 4 in the morning would be the time. It was the deepest part of the night, the hour when the camp was at its most still. When even the guards were weary and inattentive, the moon was a thin, useless sliver, hidden behind a thick blanket of clouds. The world was draped in a perfect, concealing darkness. He listened to the sounds of the night, a distant dog barking, the wind rustling the canvas, the soft symphony of sleeping breaths all around him. He felt a strange calm settle over him. The time for planning, for fearing, for doubting was over. There was only the act itself. With a breath that felt like his first and his last, he slowly, carefully, pushed his own blanket aside and rose to his feet. He moved toward his sister's cot, his shadow a silent promise in the gloom. The point of no return had arrived. The first and most dangerous step was waking Rosie. Elijah moved to her cot, his bare feet making no sound on the packed earth, and knelt beside her. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder, the warmth of her small body a stark contrast to the cold fear that gripped him. Her eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes wide with confusion in the gloom. Before she could make a sound, he brought a finger to his lips and whispered the lie he had so carefully constructed. He spoke of a secret game, a pre-dawn adventure to find a hidden castle just for them. He watched the sleepiness in her eyes give way to a flicker of childlike excitement, a testament to her unwavering trust in him. That trust was both his greatest tool and his heaviest burden. He helped her into her worn coat, his movements swift and silent, praying that her innocence would be a shield against the reality of their flight into the unknown. With Rosie's hand clutched tightly in his, he retrieved the canvas sack from its hiding place. The weight of the 2 loaves of bread and the jar of water felt immense, a physical manifestation of their desperate gamble for survival. They moved like ghosts through the cavernous tent, stepping carefully around the sleeping forms of other families, their quiet breaths and occasional coughs, a soft rhythmic backdrop to the frantic pounding of Elijah's heart. Each shadow seemed to hold a threat, every rustle of a blanket a potential alarm. He guided Rosie with gentle pressure, his body a shield between her and the sleeping world they were leaving behind. He was acutely aware of every sound, every shift in the air, his senses honed to a razor's edge by the sheer terror of being discovered. The world had shrunk to this single, perilous journey from their cots to the tent flap, a distance of 20 feet that felt like a mile. Reaching the entrance, he paused, his hand hovering over the heavy canvas. Pushing it aside could create a sudden gust of wind, a rustling sound loud enough to stir the lightest sleeper. He held his breath, listening to the symphony of the night outside, the whisper of the wind, the distant cry of a night bird. The sounds of nature were a comfort, a promise of a world beyond this tent of sorrow. Slowly, meticulously, he lifted the corner of the flap just enough for them to slip through, the coarse fabric scraping softly against his coat. The cold night air hit them, sharp and clean, smelling of damp earth and wood smoke. They were outside. They had cleared the first hurdle, but now they stood exposed under the vast starless sky, the relative safety of the crowded tent replaced by the open vulnerability of the camp. Their next objective was the makeshift pen where Rusty was kept, a small enclosure at the far edge of the camp. The ground was treacherous in the dark, a minefield of unseen rocks, discarded lumber, and deep muddy ruts left by supply wagons. Elijah kept one hand on Rosie, the other gripping the sack, his eyes straining to pierce the oppressive gloom. He moved with a memory of the terrain, a map he had unconsciously drawn in his mind over the past 2 weeks. At one point, his foot caught on a half-buried piece of timber, and he stumbled, a small gasp escaping his lips as he fought for balance. The jar of water clinked against something in the sack, a sound that seemed to shatter the silence of the night. He froze instantly, his body rigid, every muscle screaming. He waited, listening for any sign that he had been heard, but the camp remained asleep, oblivious to the 2 small figures stealing away into the darkness. They reached the pen, a flimsy construction of salvaged fence posts and wire. Rusty was a dark, solid shape within, his head lifting at their approach. Elijah's heart sank as he saw the gate's latch, a simple iron hook, but one that was rusted and likely to protest loudly. He handed the sack to Rosie, whispering for her to hold it tight, and approached the gate. He wrapped both hands around the cold, gritty metal, applying slow, steady pressure. He tried to lift it gently, but it wouldn't budge. He had no choice but to use more force. A sharp, metallic groan cut through the night, a sound so loud it seemed to echo across the entire camp. Panic seized him, cold and absolute. He expected shouts, the flare of a lantern, the sound of running feet. He grabbed Rusty's rope halter, his mind racing, preparing to simply run for it. The donkey was calm, a steadying presence in Elijah's rising panic. He nuzzled Elijah's hand, his warm breath a small comfort in the chilling night. Elijah pulled the animal from the pen, the donkey's lame leg causing him to move with a familiar uneven gait. He closed the gate as quietly as he could, the sound of his own ragged breathing filling his ears. He looked back toward the tents, his eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. For a moment there was nothing. Then a point of light appeared, swaying back and forth as it moved along the perimeter. A guard. A cold dread washed over Elijah. They were caught in the open, with nowhere to hide but the thin shadow cast by a stack of crates piled near the edge of the camp. It was a pathetic hiding place, but it was their only chance. He acted on pure instinct, his fear a powerful fuel. He pushed Rosie behind the crates, pulling Rusty in after them, his hand clamped gently over the donkey's muzzle to prevent a stray bray. He pressed his body flat against the rough wood, his heart hammering a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The lantern light grew brighter, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to reach for them. He could hear the crunch of the guards' boots on the gravelly earth, a steady approaching beat that sounded like a death knell. He held his breath until his lungs burned, his entire being focused on remaining invisible. Rosie was trembling beside him, her small body pressed against his, her fear a palpable thing in the cramped, dark space. He could feel her silent tears soaking into his sleeve, and the protective fury he felt momentarily eclipsed his own terror. The light swept over their hiding spot, the yellow beam passing just a foot above their heads. Elijah could smell the faint scent of kerosene from the lantern, could hear the soft sigh of the guard as he paused, stretching his arms. For a terrifying, eternal moment, the man stood perfectly still, his silhouette framed against the dim glow of his own light. Elijah was certain they were discovered, that any second a rough hand would grab his shoulder. But then the guard let out a great, jaw-cracking yawn, turned, and continued his patrol in the opposite direction, his footsteps slowly receding into the night. The relief was so profound, it left Elijah weak, his legs trembling uncontrollably. They had been spared by nothing more than a moment of a stranger's weariness, a sliver of pure, dumb luck in a world that had offered them none. He waited another full minute, his ears straining in the silence, before he dared to move. The immediate danger had passed, but the encounter had shattered any illusion of a clean escape. They were exposed, vulnerable, and every second they remained near the camp increased their chances of being found. He helped Rosie to her feet, and without a word, lifted her onto Rusty's sturdy back. She was small, but her weight was a strain on his tired arms. He settled her onto the donkey's blanket, her small hands gripping the coarse mane for balance. He then slung the canvas sack over his own shoulder and took the donkey's rope in his hand. The roles were now set. He was the guide, the protector, the engine of their journey, leading his small, broken caravan away from the ruins of their past and into a future that was a complete and terrifying void. They moved away from the camp, their path lit only by the faint, diffused light of a clouded sky. The cluster of tents, a place of both refuge and betrayal, shrank behind them, its few scattered lanterns becoming distant, hazy stars. The familiar sounds of the settlement faded, replaced by the symphony of the wilderness, the insistent chirping of crickets, the rustle of unseen creatures in the undergrowth, the low moan of the wind through the skeletal branches of storm-damaged trees. Elijah focused on the feel of the ground beneath his feet, the gentle upward slope that he hoped was the beginning of the foothills. He was walking away from the only world he had ever known, a 13-year-old boy leading his sister and a lame donkey into the vast, dark unknown of the Ozark Mountains. Once they were a quarter-mile from the camp, a new kind of fear set in. The darkness was no longer a cloak but a suffocating blanket. The clouds were a thick, impenetrable veil, hiding the moon and stars that his father had taught him to use for direction. A wave of disorientation washed over him, a sickening feeling of being utterly lost. Every tree looked the same, every shadow a potential dead end. For a paralyzing moment he stopped, the weight of his decision crashing down on him. What if he was leading them in circles? What if he was marching them deeper into a trackless wilderness from which they would never emerge? The lie he told Rosie about a hidden castle felt like a cruel joke, a childish fantasy in the face of this immense, indifferent darkness. He closed his eyes, forcing the panic down. He remembered his father's voice, calm and steady, during a hunting trip years ago, when they had become briefly disoriented. "The land has its own language, son. You just have to learn to listen." He opened his eyes and focused not on what he couldn't see, but on what he could feel. He felt the persistent direction of the wind on his cheek. He felt the slight but undeniable incline of the path beneath his worn shoes. He remembered a tattered map in their old kitchen, the road to the mountains running north from their town. He turned his face until the wind was at his back, aligned the slope of the land with his memory, and chose a path. It was a guess, A desperate act of faith, but it was a direction. And a direction was a weapon against the chaos that threatened to consume them. They finally reached the tree line, a solid wall of blackness that marked the true beginning of the wilderness. The trees rose like silent, ancient sentinels, their branches interlocking to form a dense canopy that blocked out what little light remained in the sky. Stepping into the forest was like entering another world. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of pine needles and damp, decaying leaves. The sounds changed, becoming more intimate and immediate. The snap of a twig under Rusty's hoof, the soft brush of a fern against Elijah's leg. This was it. They had made it. They had escaped the camp, slipped past the guard, and left Vernon's world behind. A wave of temporary, exhausted relief washed over Elijah. They were hidden now, swallowed by the forest, the first and most dangerous part of their journey complete. He paused just inside the cover of the trees, allowing himself one last look back. In the distance, the relief camp was just a handful of faint, smudged lights against the horizon, a place that already felt like it belonged to another lifetime. There was no sense of victory, no feeling of triumph, only the profound and heavy understanding of their isolation. He was utterly and completely responsible for the small, sleeping girl on the donkey's back. He turned his face away from the past and looked into the impenetrable darkness of the woods ahead. He did not know what dangers lay in wait, what hardships they would face, or if the mythical Caldwell Deadweight even truly existed as a place they could reach. All he knew was that he had to keep moving forward. He tugged gently on Rusty's rope and took his first step into the deep woods, a boy marching toward a destination he had never seen, driven by a promise he had made to himself in the dark. And so, after 6 days of relentless travel, they arrived. The air on the ridge was thin and carried the scent of pine and damp earth, a smell that did little to mask the stench of failure clinging to 13-year-old Elijah Caldwell. He stood on the edge of the 40 acres his family had always called the Caldwell Deadweight, his gaze fixed on the scene of their supposed refuge. The cabin's roof sagged in the middle like a broken spine. The barn leaned precariously to one side as if exhausted, and the fields were so choked with grey, flat stones they looked like a graveyard for forgotten giants. Beside him, their old donkey, Rusty, let out a weary sigh, his lame leg trembling from the journey. The crushing weight of his decision settled upon Elijah's shoulders. He had envisioned a sanctuary, a place of safety, but what stood before them was a monument to decay, a final, mocking testament to the worthlessness of their inheritance. He had led them from one impossible situation into another. A small, choked sob broke the silence. Elijah looked down at his 6-year-old sister, Rosie, whose face was a mess of dirt and tears. She tugged on his worn shirt sleeve, her voice a fragile whisper that the wind nearly stole away. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with a terror that pierced him deeper than any hunger or cold they had endured, and asked the one question he had no answer for. "Elijah, is this where we're going to die?" The words were not an accusation, but a simple, terrifying inquiry from a child who had seen the world swallow her parents and her home. For Elijah, the question was a judgment. It was the voice of his own deepest fear, now given sound. He felt the last of his strength, the resolve that had carried him through 6 days of wilderness, crumble into dust. He had failed her. He had brought his sister to the end of the world to watch her perish. He had no words of comfort, no lie left to tell. The fantasy of a hidden castle he had woven for her felt like a cruel and bitter joke in the face of this stark, dilapidated reality. He knelt, pulling her small, trembling body into his arms, burying his face in her tangled hair to hide the tears that threatened to betray him. He held her tightly, trying to offer the warmth his own body was quickly losing to the evening chill. The silence that stretched between them was heavy with unspoken despair. He had promised to protect her, to keep her safe, and this broken-down farm was the sum of his efforts. It was a promise shattered against a wall of stone and rotting timber. He felt like a captain who had steered their tiny, battered ship through a hurricane, only to wreck it upon the shores of a barren island. After a long moment, he helped Rosie to her feet and led her toward the cabin, his movements slow and leaden, as if wading through a thick, invisible mud of defeat. They stepped onto the sagging porch, the wood groaning under their slight weight as if in protest. He sat his sister down on the top step. her back against a splintered post, while he remained standing, a sentry guarding a ruin. Rusty, their steadfast companion, lowered his head, his own exhaustion a mirror of their own. The sun was beginning to dip below the jagged line of the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for such a desolate place. For Elijah, the sunset was not a promise of a new day, but the closing of a final curtain on their hope. They were utterly alone, stranded in a place forgotten by God and man. It was then that Rusty, the animal everyone had considered a useless burden, did something strange. Instead of trying to graze on the sparse dry patches of grass near the cabin, he lifted his head, his ears twitching as if listening to a sound only he could hear. He turned and, with a surprising sense of purpose, began to limp away from the cabin, his gait uneven but determined. He moved past the leaning barn and toward a large grey limestone outcropping that jutted from the earth like the fossilized bone of some ancient creature. Elijah watched him, his mind too numb with despair to fully process the donkey's odd behavior. He assumed the animal was simply searching for better forage, a pointless quest in this stone-choked landscape. He was a lame donkey on a dead piece of land, a perfect symbol of their hopeless situation. But Rusty did not stop to graze. When he reached the base of the limestone rock, he lowered his head and began to paw at the ground. It was not an idle scrape, but a focused, deliberate action, his hoof digging into the dry, packed earth with a rhythmic insistence. The sound was soft, a persistent scratching that cut through the evening stillness. Elijah frowned, a flicker of confusion piercing through his fog of misery. Why there? The ground was no different from any other patch of rocky soil on the entire 40 acres, yet the donkey continued, his efforts uncovering a small patch of darker, damper-looking dirt beneath the surface. He snorted, digging with more urgency, as if he had found something of immense importance, a secret hidden just beneath the skin of the dead land. A strange, unbidden curiosity compelled Elijah to move. His legs felt like lead, and every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but he pushed himself off the porch railing and walked slowly toward the donkey. He felt a foolish, desperate sliver of hope, a feeling so dangerous he immediately tried to crush it. He knelt beside Rusty, his knees pressing into the sharp gravel. He shooed the donkey gently aside and looked at the spot. It was nothing more than a shallow hole, the earth slightly damp to the touch. He hesitated, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fragile anticipation. He was afraid to hope, afraid of another disappointment that might break him completely. But the donkey's strange certainty was infectious, a primal instinct that seemed to bypass his own despair. With a deep breath, he plunged his hands into the loosened soil. The earth was cool and surprisingly soft beneath the surface layer of rock and dust. He dug with his bare fingers, scooping away handfuls of dirt, his movements growing more frantic. He felt it then, not just dampness, but a distinct and undeniable wetness. He cleared away another layer of soil and saw it, a sight so impossible it made his breath catch in his throat. Water. A small, clear pool of it was welling up from between the roots of an old, gnarled tree, bubbling slowly but steadily from a hidden source deep within the earth. It wasn't a puddle from some recent rain, it was alive, a pulse beating within the stone heart of the mountain. He stared, unblinking, as the small pool slowly filled, the water clear as glass. He cupped his hands and lowered them into the impossibly cold water, the shock of it a jolt to his exhausted system. He raised his hands to his lips and drank. The water was pure, clean and sweet, with a mineral taste that spoke of deep ancient rock. It was the taste of life itself. A natural spring, hidden on a patch of land everyone had written off as dead and useless. He drank again, the cold water soothing his parched throat and extinguishing a fire of thirst he hadn't even realized was burning so intensely. He looked at his hands, dripping with the lifeblood of the mountain, and then he looked at the derelict cabin and the stone-filled fields, and for the first time he saw not a graveyard, but a beginning. The tears he had fought so hard to contain for 6 long days finally broke free. They streamed down his dirty cheeks, silent and hot, but they were not tears of sorrow or failure. It was a release of every ounce of fear, every moment of terror, every crushing weight of responsibility he had carried on his young shoulders. He wasn't crying because he was sad. He was crying because, for the first time since the tornado had ripped his world apart, he felt a flicker of something he had thought was lost forever. He was crying because a lame, useless donkey had led him to a miracle. He was crying because, in a place that was supposed to be where they came to die, he had just found a reason to live. The discovery of the spring was a fissure in the wall of Elijah's despair, a crack through which a thin, fragile light began to seep. That night, after he had seen to Rusty and settled a now sleeping Rosie onto a makeshift bed of dry leaves inside the derelict cabin, he sat alone on the cold stone of the hearth. The water had been a miracle, a reprieve from the immediate threat of thirst, but the larger reality of their situation remained a crushing weight. They had water, but they had no food, no shelter from the coming winter, no real hope beyond surviving another day. The cabin itself was a shell, its gaping roof a constant reminder of their vulnerability. He stared into the darkness of the empty fireplace, the chill of the stone seeping into his bones, feeling the familiar tendrils of hopelessness begin to wrap around him once more, whispering that the spring was not a beginning, but merely a brief delay of the inevitable end. His gaze drifted over the rough, uneven stones of the hearth, the same kind of flat grey rocks that littered the fields outside. His father had built this fireplace with his own hands during a summer long ago, a fact he'd mentioned once with a mixture of pride and frustration. Elijah ran his hand over the cool, gritty surface, tracing the lines of dried mortar. One of the stones, near the bottom corner, was slightly loose. He had noticed it earlier when he swept the debris from the hearth, but had paid it no mind. Now, in the profound silence of the night, it drew his attention. It was a small thing, a minor imperfection, but his mind, desperate for any distraction from his fears, latched onto it. He pressed his fingers against the edge of the stone, feeling it give way slightly, a subtle shift that sent a strange, inexplicable tremor of anticipation through him. He worked at it carefully, his fingers digging into the crumbling mortar around the edges. The stone resisted at first, held in place by the memory of its own weight and the passage of years, but Elijah was persistent. He used the tip of his small pocket knife to pry at the edges, chipping away at the old binding until, with a soft, grinding sound, the stone came free. He pulled it out and set it aside, revealing a dark, rectangular cavity behind it. It was not a natural gap. It was a space deliberately created, a small hidden chamber tucked away in the heart of the home. His breath caught in his throat, and his heart began to pound a heavy, frantic rhythm against his ribs. He reached a trembling hand into the cold, dusty void, his fingers brushing against something wrapped in oilcloth, a package that was heavy and solid to the touch. He pulled the object out into the faint moonlight that streamed through the hole in the roof. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn smooth by time and handling, the oilcloth protecting it from the dampness of the years. Tied around it with a piece of twine was a small folded piece of paper. He carefully untied the twine, his fingers clumsy with a mixture of reverence and fear. He unfolded the paper first. It was a property deed, the official document for these 40 acres. But what made his eyes blur with sudden tears was the name written on the line for the owner, Elijah and Rose Caldwell. His father had put the land in their names. It was not just an inheritance, it was a gift, a final, deliberate act of provision from beyond the grave, ensuring that no one, not even Uncle Vernon, could legally take it from them. With a shaking hand, he opened the journal. The first page contained his father's familiar, blocky handwriting. The words were not a letter, but a simple statement, a title for the pages that followed. The Caldwell Deadweight, a study of its true purpose. Elijah's mind reeled. His father had never called it that with the same dismissive laugh as everyone else. For him, it had not been a joke. It had been a puzzle to be solved. He turned the page, and the world he thought he knew, the entire history of his family and this land, began to fundamentally reshape itself before his eyes. The pages were filled not with words of despair or frustration, but with meticulous observations, detailed sketches, and carefully recorded data, the work of a man who had seen a secret world hidden beneath the surface of failure. He saw sketches of the very limestone outcropping where Rusty had led them, with arrows pointing to the exact spot where the spring emerged. His father had known. He had known about the water all along. There were notes scrawled in the margins, observations on the water's flow during different seasons, its consistent temperature, its unique mineral content. Thomas Caldwell had not been ignorant of the land's greatest treasure. He had been its secret keeper, its silent guardian. He had understood that the spring was the key, the beating heart of this place, and he had documented it with the precision of a scientist, waiting for a time when its value could finally be unlocked. The knowledge struck Elijah with the force of a physical blow, a revelation so profound it left him breathless. He had not stumbled upon a miracle by chance. He had been guided to it by a love that had laid the path for him years before he ever needed to walk it. As he turned more pages, the secret of the land continued to unfold. There were detailed drawings of plants, many of which Elijah recognized from their journey through the woods. Next to a sketch of a plant with distinctive forked roots, his father had written, "American ginseng, thrives in the acidic soil near the eastern ridge. Highly valuable." Beside another drawing of a plant with a golden yellow root, he read, "Golden seal, prefers the shade of the north-facing slopes, a powerful medicine." Page after page revealed a hidden ecosystem of valuable medicinal herbs, plants that did not just survive in the rocky, acidic soil, but flourished because of it. His father had catalogued them all, noting their locations, their peak harvesting times, and their potential market value. He had seen that the land's perceived weakness, its poor soil, was, in fact, its greatest and most unique strength. Elijah felt the memories of his father's words shifting inside him, rearranging themselves into a new and beautiful mosaic. He remembered his father standing on their old porch, looking toward the distant mountains and saying, "Bad land is just land that hasn't found its purpose." Elijah had always thought it was a statement of weary resignation, an acceptance of failure. Now he understood it was a declaration of faith, a secret belief in the potential that no one else could see. Every sigh, every frustrated comment about the deadweight had been a mask, a way to protect this secret, to keep the land undervalued and safe from the greedy eyes of others, until he could find a way to make his dream for it a reality. He had been playing a long, patient game, not for himself, but for them. Tucked between 2 pages near the end of the journal was a single perfectly preserved wildflower, a Queen Anne's lace. It was his mother's favorite. He remembered her tucking one behind her ear on a warm summer afternoon, her smile as bright as the sun. The presence of that delicate white flower in his father's secret book was an intimate and powerful testament. This was not just his father's dream. It had been their dream, his mother's as well. It was a shared vision for a different kind of life, a future they were quietly building, a legacy of hope they intended to leave for their children. The flower was a whisper from his mother, a confirmation that her love was also woven into the fabric of this place, a gentle presence that had been waiting for them here all along. The final entry in the journal was different from the rest. The scientific observations gave way to a deeply personal message, written as if to a ghost, to a future that his father could only imagine. "If you are reading this," it began, "it means that life has not gone as planned. It means you have come here not out of choice, but out of need. Do not see this place as an end. Do not believe the name the world has given it. The world sees only the rocks, but I have seen the water that flows beneath them and the life that grows between them. This land is not a dead weight. It is an anchor. It is a place to hold fast when the storms come. It is hard and it is stubborn, but it is also true. Learn its language, and it will provide. It will keep you safe." The words were a direct communication across the chasm of death, a hand reaching out from the past to steady him in the present. He read the final lines through a thick, blurring veil of tears. "I do not know what sorrow has brought you to this door, but know this. You were never meant to be alone. Everything I have learned, everything I have saved, has been for you. This land is my final promise. It is the best I had to give. Make it your own. Find its purpose and you will find yours. Be strong, my children, and be good to each other." Elijah closed the journal and hugged it to his chest, the worn leather a poor substitute for the arms he so desperately missed. The tears he had shed at the spring were born of relief, but these were tears of a different kind. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude, of profound aching love, and of a deep soul-shattering understanding. He was not an orphan abandoned to a cruel fate. He was a son who had been given a map. The full weight of his father's love, a love that had been so vast and so forward-thinking it had transcended death itself, settled over him. He had not led Rosie to a place where they would die. He had, by some blind, desperate instinct, followed the invisible path his father had laid for him. He had brought them home. The derelict cabin was not a symbol of failure. It was the starting point of his father's unfinished dream. The leaning barn, the stone-choked fields, the sagging roof, they were not signs of decay, but a canvas waiting for new life, a project waiting for the hands that would complete it. He was not just a survivor, he was an heir, not to a piece of worthless land, but to a legacy of quiet strength, profound wisdom, and unconditional love. He finally understood. He was not alone, and he never had been. From the moment he'd pulled his sister from the ruins of their old life, his father's foresight had been a silent, unseen guardian. It was his father's knowledge that had planted the seed of this destination in his memory. It was his father's love that had hidden the deed and the journal, a final provision against a world he knew could be cruel. The journey had been his own, the courage had been his own, but the destination had been a gift. He looked around the dark, broken cabin, but he no longer saw a ruin. He saw a sanctuary, a place imbued with the spirit of his parents, a foundation upon which they could build a new life, not from the ashes of their past, but from the seeds their parents had so carefully planted. The grief for his father, a raw and gaping wound, began to transform into something else. It became a source of strength, a profound sense of connection that death could not sever. He was not just mourning a man who was gone. He was honoring a man who was still present in every rock, every plant, every drop of water from the hidden spring. His father had not left him with a burden. He had left him with a purpose. The fear of the future, the terrifying uncertainty that had haunted his every step, receded, replaced by a calm, steady resolve. He knew what he had to do. He had to learn the land's language. Just as his father had, he had to finish the work that had been started. He had to build a life here for himself and for Rosie. He thought of Rosie, sleeping peacefully just a few feet away, her innocence protected by his lies about a hidden castle. He realized now that he hadn't been lying at all. This place, with its hidden water and secret life, with the protective magic of their parents' love embedded in its very soil, was more of a castle than any stone fortress. It was a place of true refuge, a kingdom of two, built on a foundation of love that was stronger than any storm. He felt a wave of peace wash over him, a deep and profound calm that settled into the very marrow of his bones. The crushing weight of responsibility for his sister's life was still there, but it no longer felt like a burden that would break him. Instead, it felt like a shared task, a sacred duty he would now carry forward with his father's unseen help. He stood up and walked to the cabin door, the journal held tightly in his hand. He looked out at the land, at the silhouettes of the mountains against a sky that was just beginning to lighten in the east. The world was no longer a vast, terrifying unknown. It was his. It was theirs. The stones in the fields were not obstacles, they were guardians. The leaning barn was not a sign of decay. It was a promise of work to be done. He was 13 years old, standing on a patch of land the world had named a failure, with nothing but a lame donkey, a sleeping sister, and a book full of his dead father's dreams. And for the first time in a long, long time, he felt an undeniable and inextinguishable flicker of hope. He was not at the end of his journey, he was at the very beginning. The arrival of Ada Sixkiller 2 days later felt less like a chance encounter and more like the next chapter of his father's book being written into life. She was an elderly Cherokee woman whose land bordered theirs, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her eyes holding a calm, ancient wisdom. She had seen the faint wisp of smoke from his small, struggling fire and had come to investigate, not with suspicion, but with a basket of fresh eggs and a warm, unleavened bread. She did not ask about their parents or how they had come to be there. She simply looked at the two children, at the exhaustion etched onto Elijah's face and the silent watchfulness in Rosie's eyes. and seemed to understand everything without a single word being spoken. Her presence was a quiet, grounding force, the first true human kindness they had known since the storm. Elijah, emboldened by his father's journal, showed her the spring. She knelt and tasted the water, her eyes closing for a long moment. When she opened them, she looked at him with a newfound respect. Then he showed her the journal, the detailed sketches of the plants. A slow, knowing smile spread across her face. She walked with him through the rocky fields, pointing out the very plants his father had drawn, giving them their Cherokee names alongside the English ones. She confirmed everything, identifying the ginseng, the golden seal, the wild mint that grew in abundance in the damp soil near the spring. She explained that her people had harvested these medicines from these hills for generations, that the unique combination of the mineral-rich water and the acidic soil made them more potent than those found anywhere else. The worthless rocks, she showed him, created perfect, naturally irrigated terraces for protecting and cultivating the most valuable plants. Under Ada's gentle tutelage, their life found a new rhythm, one dictated not by fear and flight, but by the seasons and the needs of the land. She taught Elijah the sustainable way to harvest the roots, how to take only what he needed and replant a part of each one to ensure the future of the crop. She taught Rosie, whose silence began to break in the old woman's calming presence, how to carefully wash and dry the herbs and bundle them for sale. Their days became a cycle of meaningful work. Rusty, the lame donkey, found his own purpose, his steady, patient strength perfect for carrying the woven baskets of dried herbs down the winding mountain path each week to a trading post, where the owner paid them a fair price, no questions asked. The land, once a symbol of desolation, had become their provider, their partner, their purpose. The income from the herbs was modest at first, but it was more than enough. It was enough to buy flour, salt, and beans. It was enough to purchase nails and salvaged lumber to begin the slow, arduous process of repairing the cabin's roof. Elijah worked with a tireless determination, his father's journal his constant guide, Ada's practical advice his instruction manual. With each nail he hammered, with each board he replaced, he felt he was not just building a shelter, but honoring a promise. Rosie's laughter, a sound he had feared he would never hear again, began to echo through the small valley as she tended to her herb-drying racks. Her world once again filled with the simple, profound magic of a child's purpose. They were not just surviving, they were building a life, a real and tangible thing, rooted in the rocky soil of their inheritance. 2 years passed in this way, a quiet and healing time that transformed them. Elijah grew taller and stronger, the uncertainty of the boy replaced by the quiet confidence of the young man who had learned the language of his land. Rosie blossomed, her trauma receding like a distant storm cloud, replaced by a deep love for her mountain home. And then, one autumn afternoon, the world they had left behind found them. A polished black car looking alien and profane against the rustic landscape rumbled its way up the trail. Uncle Vernon stepped out, his city clothes looking even more out of place than before, a sheaf of legal papers in his hand. He had a greedy, triumphant smile on his face, having finally tracked down the worthless property, which he had learned was now registered in the children's names and generating a small but steady income. But when Vernon approached the cabin to claim what he believed was his, he was met not by 2 frightened, helpless children, but by a calm and unmovable wall. Ada Sixkiller stood on the porch, her arms crossed. Beside her stood another man, a tall, stern-faced Cherokee with kind eyes, who introduced himself as John Ross Whitaker, a lawyer for the Cherokee Nation. Vernon's confident bluster faltered as Mr. Whitaker calmly presented his own set of documents, sworn affidavits from people in their old town detailing Vernon's neglect, bank records showing his inquiries into the insurance payout, and a signed statement from the family he had tried to sell Rosie to, who had grown a conscience and confessed the entire arrangement. The trap Vernon had set for them had become his own. His arrest for fraud and attempted human trafficking was swift and quiet, a pathetic and ignominious end to his greed. The farm never became famous, and the Caldwells never became rich. But under the legal protection and quiet guardianship of Ada and the Cherokee community, they thrived. The land provided everything they needed. its stony fields a constant reminder that the greatest value is often hidden beneath a difficult surface. Decades later, Elijah's own grandchildren would learn to harvest ginseng from those same rocky slopes, their laughter echoing in the same valley. And at the entrance to the 40 acres, at the start of the path leading to the small, sturdy cabin with its smoke-wisping chimney, a weathered wooden sign still stands. It was carved by Rosie when she was 8 years old, her hands guided by Ada. The letters are uneven, childish, and burned deep into the wood, carrying a simple truth that had become their family's creed, the final perfect title to their story. The land that found its purpose.